lot of the efficiency that the industry, and when I say industry, I mean retailers and suppliers, realized together in the 90s and 2000s was driven by the largest suppliers really working collaboratively with the largest retailers to think about that end-to-end value chain of like, where do the inputs come from and how do they get transformed into outputs? And how can we make longer term investments together that will benefit all of us? And so I think that discussion is one that I don't really see happening among many of the sort of usual suspects. But it's beginning to, just because there's no avoiding it.
All right, Keith, welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Good to be with you.
Yeah, would love to hear just a little bit about your background and Profitero to get started.
Sure. Profitero is an e-commerce performance analytics company that works with retailers and brands, really in a couple areas, but ultimately helping brands understand their performance and how they're positioned on Amazon, Walmart, Kroger, 8,000 retailers globally. I lead strategy, which is really about working with our new CEO, Brian Weiner, on sort of the long-term roadmap, which is a lot of what are we going to build, who do we need to work effectively with in the broader ecosystem. And my background, I've been at the company for years. I joined just as the founders raised the Series A round of venture capital. And I knew them and the investors from my past life as an industry analyst and consultant, where when I started, it was purely focused on brick and mortar. And then I saw technology growing in importance in people's lives and thought it was going to intersect with retail in a big way. And then started studying that relationship and saw the rise of Amazon and e-commerce, and spent a lot of time helping companies first see this is going to happen even to you, and deciding after years of hand-wringing, we're going to do it, then figuring out what doing it meant from a strategic point of view. What kind of team do you have to build? What kind of tools do you need? And what are the big competencies and capabilities you need to be effective working with and through retailers?
Yeah. And how long ago? How long have you technically been in the e-commerce industry then?
I guess 15 years roughly.
Okay, yeah. So you're a veteran.
Predating that, another 5 years as a consumer.
Got it.
Yep. I remember fondly, services like Cosmo, which was one of the original sort of same day delivery.
Yep.
E-commerce models. And for those that may not have been as heavy users of that service as I was, they would deliver anything you would find in a convenience store to you in 30 minutes with no delivery fee at the same price. And for some reason, that business proved not to be economically sustainable.
Yeah, weird. Who knew?
Yeah. So that topic of unit economics and economic sustainability is a big one at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's funny how many 2000 era business models there were that have like weirdly come sort of full circle now, where it seemed like the future, and then a year later it seemed insane, and now everyone's talking about doing the same thing again. So and losing just as much money as they were back then.
Losing money, but I think what I learned from the time I spent hanging out with a lot of venture capitalists is knowing what is going to happen, or at least having a good thesis, is not the hard part. Timing is really the hard part. And I used to show these videos of IBM ads from the early 80s that sort of previewed all these technologies like video calls and GPS and contactless payments. And the reason I would show those videos was and this is not to pick on IBM, but when you sort of look back at all those technologies that came to market and think about what company you associate with
Yeah,
any of them, uh,
not IBM.
it was not the company that sort of was promoting the idea. It was
Yeah,
the companies that did it. And I think contextually, when Cosmo was around, there was no broadband internet. Smartphone penetration wasn't
yeah,
north of 90%.
sure.
There's a lot that's very different, both from a demand and a sort of unit economic point of view.
Yeah, yeah, super interesting. So let's circle back on the unit economic kind of conversation. But before we do that, we talked a little bit before the show about kind of this metaphor of e-commerce in adolescence, now starting to maybe come into adulthood. How do you think about that broadly?
I think, when I started working in this area, especially in sort of the consumer products, CPG world, uh, the audience that I was speaking to had titles like Director of Alternative Channels, which would include e-commerce alongside the discounters and the military and club channels.
Yep.
And the only commonality between these channels is they're very different.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it was a sort of not just a general management role, but it was like generally managing things that were not as important to the business as sort of the core,
Sure.
and were each pretty challenging to manage. But as it has grown and evolved, there's been a fairly natural progression across the industry where it may have graduated from being one of four hats that the director of alternative channels wore to a single hat that a director of e-commerce wears, to what now, when I think, e-commerce as we commonly define it represents roughly 10% of total e-commerce, much more over the last 3 months, naturally.
Sure.
Look at sort of the stable run rate before the pandemic. It's reached double digit shares across broad categories, and it's significantly higher in some categories, even in the later categories to migrate, like grocery and CPG. It's now at a scale that has put it on the radar of the C-suite and the board.
Yep.
And that's only accelerated over the last several months. And
Sure.
so I think, the awkward adolescence is really all about the realization that this is not something that is sort of easily contained or managed in a specialist discipline, but it's something that has implications to most functions across the business. That is, you think of a sort of top tier CPG company suddenly with so many constraints on how people can shop and what they can buy, and online grocery and e-commerce among the only options people have. Suddenly, the category management team has a lot of questions. The shopper marketing team wants to know how they can help. And certainly, as you're starting to do deeper analysis of scenarios for whether this remains at the elevated levels that we've seen over the last few months or reverts to the mean or somewhere between, everybody is really starting to try to broaden their understanding. And that means, when going back to my consulting days, I was working with many early sort of directors and VPs of e-commerce uh, who were among the sort of pioneers at the big brands. And we would say in those days, half of your time is going to be spent on what we would think of as the internal sell.
Yeah.
Uh,
Sure.
and the internal sell in those days was really about just convincing people that you should exist. Like that,
Yeah.
it was basically justify the job.
Yep.
And fight for every dollar. Now I think the internal sell is probably going to continue to occupy 50% of your time, but it's much more about education and sort of development. I mean, the conversations that are happening in a lot of companies are, how do we establish a common vocabulary so that when we use these terms, everybody is clear on what's in scope and out of scope and what it means to them and their role. If people need new skills or need different tools, how, given all of the pressures across work that we're already doing, how do we help retrain or upskill uh, people who have deep expertise about our business as it operates today and institutional knowledge about how we got where we are, but can really rapidly reimagine that expertise and how they work to be relevant in this.
Yeah. So you don't have to name names here, but when you think about an organization that's doing this really well, I mean, what are some of the things that they're doing maybe that put them ahead of their peers?
I think if you've got endorsement from the top down, that's one of the prerequisites, just to uh, make it clear to the organization that this is not something that might meet resistance from up the ladder. It's something that is fully endorsed.
Yep.
I think it's important to be thoughtful about the distinction between dedicated and designated focus. And what I mean is, uh, someone who's designated as responsible usually has 4 or 5 other things
Hmm.
that are higher priority.
Sure. Yeah.
Dedicated means this is your job.
Yeah.
And assessing the scale and maturity of your business and figuring out where do we need people dedicated by account or by discipline to build out accounting. And by the way, that may often involve external partners. There are so many cases these days where either because you lack the in-house expertise or you need the variable expense versus fixed headcount.
Yeah. Sure.
You're looking at external support and internal. So I think that's another important one. I think the training piece is a big part of it, and helping the entire organization understand what's happening, firstly, and then what it means to the company, and lastly, what it means to them, is a very big discussion. And how to do that training in the current situation where we're not going to be filling auditoriums is an interesting one, because the way that it's commonly done is through those kinds of workshops.
Sure.
So it's going to be an interesting evolution. I think the good news is e-learning and that sort of training has really come a long way.
Yeah. Hey everyone, John here. I hope you're enjoying the episode so far. I wanted to give you a quick message and let you know that this episode is sponsored by Orca Pacific. Orca Pacific is a full-service agency with an exclusive focus on Amazon. We have capabilities in really everything a brand would need to succeed on the platform. Everything from advertising to content development and SEO, merchandising, marketing, you name it, as it relates to driving and converting demand on the platform. We have a robust suite of services on the back end related to operations, forecasting, FBA, demand planning, etc. And we do a lot on the higher level strategic elements of the platform. So think long-term planning, key negotiations, access to new and beta programs, anything and everything that has to do with accelerating a brand on the Amazon platform. If you want to hear more about what we do, please visit our website at www.orcapac.com. A salesperson will get in touch with you and we can talk more about how we can accelerate your brand on the platform. With that being said, we'll get back to the show. Yeah, interesting. So I mean, basically what you're saying is we're now at the point where for an organization, a brand to approach e-commerce in the right way, it can't just be limited to an internal team, an internal person. We're at the point where that knowledge really needs to be spread throughout the organization to actually.
I think so. I mean, I see depending on the scale and type of company, I see a handful of different areas that are getting focus initially. Just within sort of digital commerce, think of the teams that have been largely oriented around Amazon or other what in the past would commonly be called pure players.
Sure.
Those teams have a certain profile. They
Yeah.
tend to be people that worked around Amazon or e-commerce for a long time. Uh, then in many companies, you may have uh, people dedicated to e-commerce on an omni-channel account team, on a Walmart or a Target team.
Sure.
But the considerations and the discipline is different.
Yep.
And there are varying levels of coordination and alignment between those teams. So that's one level of, like, we need those teams sharing sharing their knowledge and operating under a common framework where it makes sense.
Sure.
Same for direct to consumer. I mean, in a lot of big organizations, there's just a very limited connection between direct and indirect digital commerce.
Yeah.
And now that it's becoming uh, a bigger percentage of the total, the channel conflict issues that everyone has been aware of for a decade are becoming more important. And so they're trying to coordinate better on that front. And then if you think about fundamental disciplines like sales and marketing, there've been a couple jump balls over the last 3 or 4 years. The biggest, I think, being search or performance marketing.
Yeah.
Think of the importance of AMS and
Sure.
sponsored product search. And if you're on an Amazon team, you are almost certainly uh, really interested in how your sort of campaigns are managed and optimized, because it's a pretty mission critical element to your success on Amazon.
Sure.
If you're a performance marketing lead or a CMO, you've got a team that's really effective at a very similar but different and important ways.
Mm-hmm.
Discipline, doing sort of performance marketing on Google, and what we've seen just over the last few weeks with Facebook opening up shops and Google waiving listing fees for merchants on Google Shopping.
Yep.
I think there are more sort of boundaries blurring.
Yeah.
And what happens throughout the industry when those kinds of tectonic shifts begin is roles and responsibilities get a little fuzzier, and people need to start aligning and redefining who's going to do what and who's accountable for what and how we're going to measure and that sort of thing. So, I mean, compounded by all of the chaos and uncertainty of the last few months, I think some of the closer in industry shifts are really leading to some creative thinking and open questions that I don't know the answers to yet, but it's sort of an interesting time.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, the boundaries blurring phenomenon, I think, is one that's pretty universal over the last few years with e-commerce. Is it trade spend? Is it advertising spend on the platform? Is it omni-channel? Was sort of a siloed thing. Well, omni-channel just means Walmart's e-commerce. The omni-channel is Target's e-commerce. Well, now even omni-channel is omni-channel even really applicable anymore? Amazon getting into brick and mortar retailers, scaling up e-commerce in a bigger way, and then all of that kind of interconnecting. Obviously, Walmart, launching their kind of advertising property in-house. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how organizations ultimately deal with this. But it's in that interconnectivity where I think internally the battle will be won or lost. Like the chaos will either reign, or it will be kind of reined in terms of how you facilitate those teams communicating with each other. So that's really interesting. We talked a little bit earlier about unit economics. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, obviously we're 20 years since the days of Cosmo, but in some ways, Amazon and others trying to do a very similar thing, trying to ship stuff at the same price you'd buy it at a corner store in 30 minutes to your house, which is I mean, really interestingly, if you go back like 20 years and listen to some of the things Bezos was saying, was kind of the plan from the beginning. It just took him a lot longer to get there in a more, I would argue, kind of responsible way. But what are your thoughts overall? How should brands be thinking about that?
I mean, I think the backdrop is pretty closely related to the idea of e-commerce in adolescence, because we had a new, really thoughtful industry practitioner joined our team last year. And one of the first questions he asked was, what theme or topic do you think we should work on? And we agreed that because of the sort of inflection point that e-commerce was at as a percentage of sales, the pendulum that commonly swings between growth and profitability was at least in the center and maybe swinging towards profitability. And then each year we do this big annual industry benchmarking survey and ask the industry what topics are top of mind, and challenging profitability scenarios and adapting to the supply chain realities of e-commerce were literally the top two issues surfaced even a year ago. And not a year ago, sorry, 6 months ago, in 2019, December. And then just thinking what's happened since then, it's evident that some form of shift is pretty permanent. And so nobody is asking at this stage, is it going to happen? Now they're asking, is it going to remain as high as it is, or is it going to go down? All that really means is, the retailers were already under pretty significant margin pressure. And there's no question for the retailer, the ideal economics involve shoppers doing immense amounts of the work and bringing their order to their own doorstep with their vehicle and time and fuel expense. And so while click and collect from a store-based retailer's point of view has superior economics to investing in a bunch of net new fulfillment centers, compared to the business they've been operating as an industry for 100 years, it's not as profitable. So there's immense pressure on the retailers, maybe Amazon being accepted because of their unique relationship with capital. But as the retailers are facing pressure, they try to pass what they can, depending on their strategy, through to the consumer, but the consumer can't really absorb much at the moment. And so what do? You look to your suppliers. And I think a lot of what has captivated the industry since the beginning of e-commerce has been what I think of as the demand chain. How are we going to attract shoppers to our site or our app, or the marketplaces where attention is being directed? How do we engage them? How do we convert them? And so it's all about, generating traffic and converting and search and content and reviews and all those things. The supply chain and the underlying sort of physical realities that have huge implications for margin and profit have been sort of understudied or at least underemphasized during this period. There's been a lot of sort of ad hoc, let's work with whatever we have to see if we can try to force it to fit the channel, or we may think holistically about sort of one, a lot of testing and learning. But what I think is really accelerating is this need that I'm actually starting to see materialize inside of some big companies to look really holistically and think about product form through the lens of, if not doorstep delivery in a cardboard box, even click and collect. Think about packaging. Do we need the packaging to sell from a physical shelf? If we think this item is going to be predominantly purchased online,
Sure.
How can we strip packaging out? All those sort of fundamental considerations. And on an even higher level, a lot of the efficiency that the industry, and when I say industry, I mean retailers and suppliers, realized together in the 90s and 2000s was driven by the largest suppliers really working collaboratively with the largest retailers. Mm-hmm. To think about that end-to-end value chain of like, where do the inputs come from? and how do they get transformed into outputs, and how can we make longer term investments together that will benefit all of us. And so I think that discussion is one that I don't really see happening among many of the sort of usual suspects,
Yeah.
but it's beginning to, just because there's no avoiding it.
Who do you think drives that conversation? The retailer or the supplier?
Well, I think at the moment the retailer is trying to drive it, because the retailer is looking for subsidies of some of the convenience that they're being. Well, convenience is probably the wrong term for it in this context, but the retailer is having sort of an artificial shift over the last few months to these other modes of shopping, and
Sure.
so their expense structure has gone up, and they're turning to the suppliers and saying, we got to talk.
Yeah.
Inside the retailer's walls, they're looking really carefully at automation.
Yeah.
How do we automate in the fulfillment center, distribution center, store back room? Because the two biggest expenses are sort of labor and fuel, and so that is already prompting a level of capital investment that I think is of a different nature than what we've seen over the last 3 or 4 years outside of Walmart and Kroger and Target. But aside from that, I do think that there are beginning to be what I would characterize as true joint business plans
Yeah.
between certain retailers and suppliers that put them on a path, not only to have a really collaborative and efficient sort of promotional calendar and activation plans, and but they're actually thinking about aligning, longer range assets and capabilities in a way that will be more efficient and economically sustainable.
Do you think that these omni-channel retailers can get to a point where these initiatives that they were largely sort of testing and have been all of a sudden massively prioritized can truly become sustainable for them?
I think for some the answer will be yes. I think broadly it's more of a mixed bag.
Yeah.
I think the most toxic line of thinking that holds companies back until it's too late is they get paralyzed by trying to figure out, if I do this, is it going to be incremental? And in certain
Instead of
cases,
self-disruption, right? It's not incremental. It's just, this is going away. So if you don't do it a different way.
yeah, that's it. I mean, in other words, like if you're running a lemonade stand and you're asking, if I open a second lemonade stand, am I going to sell more lemonade? But what's happening is nobody wants lemons anymore.
Yeah.
You end up in a really challenging situation. And
Yeah.
so that's one pitfall. I think, at the high end of the market, where and by high end I mean, call it Walmart, Best Buy, and Target and Kroger. They have managed to either forge deep partnerships with outside parties that have done exclusive things for them, or they've been able to acquire companies, or they've been able to build competencies that give them more control over their own destinies. They get better data about their shoppers. They have more control over those shoppers' experience. Outside of them, I do think there's always this diffusion of capability to the mid and the long tail of a market, and I think players like Instacart have accelerated, at least on the demand chain, a lot of companies' ability to sell online.
Yeah.
It's not clear to me over the long term how the economics will play out for some of those players that have an intermediary between them and their consumer. But
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I wonder, Amazon has sort of set the bar, I think, for performance in e-commerce, and also set the bar for what profitability should or shouldn't look like. Uh, I think it's the airline industry as a whole never makes money. I mean, some of the airlines make money, but as a whole, the industry loses money every year. I wonder if Amazon, in some ways, has set the industry on a path to that kind of endpoint, and it's just inevitable. Because consumers want what they want, and if they can get the same price and it's more convenient or even cheaper, they're going to choose that option. They don't care about the health of the retailer, the financial health of the retailer. So it's interesting to kind of see where maybe all this is headed.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about kind of some of these packaging initiatives, maybe some things from an environmental standpoint. Any other thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, somewhat relatedly to the economic sustainability topic, is we started looking at who is sort of addressing all of these really fast-moving shifts, not in one aspect of their business, but in many aspects of their business. One of the really interesting sort of themes that we saw was the emergence of sort of a new class of digital native brand that is building their brand, their product form, their packaging, their route to market, really around a couple assumptions. One, digital commerce is likely the path forward. And so they're usually going direct to consumer, if not exclusively, usually first.
Sure.
Often pairing that with a marketplace like Amazon. And that they need to be economically sustainable. And so, I mean, this is an interesting discussion I expect is going to grow over the next couple of years about whether what we've been conditioned by Amazon to assume, selection is infinite. You should expect it faster and faster, and the prices should always be as low as possible.
Yeah.
Some of these companies are coming in pretty openly saying it's going to cost a little more, and here's why. And it's going to take 2 weeks to get there because the carbon footprint is lower if we use ground freight than air freight. But we're sending you a 4-month supply. So do you really need it in an hour or in 2 days?
Yeah.
And they're thinking of, I mean, when I say product form, there were great examples a few years ago of, for example, beverage companies looking at the unit economics of the cardboard to the doorstep e-commerce model, national ship, and saying a 12-pack of energy drinks is never going to be economically sustainable at current freight rates.
Sure.
Why don't we leave the water out and send a concentrated powder? Everybody's got tap water, maybe even filtered water.
Sure.
Maybe even bottled water. You combine the basic ingredients on your end because it makes more sense logistically. And in cases like laundry detergent, in some cases, through a really thoughtful approach to price pack architecture, you can actually charge more for things like that. So what I've seen now is in categories that I never would have anticipated that mentality would come to, pet food, toothpaste bits. It's not a paste. It's literally just like a little tablet.
Yeah, and your mouth is the rest of the water in it.
The paste is formed in your mouth.
Yeah.
So the point of that is, I think it's really interesting to see companies and brands basically thinking holistically, and not just thinking holistically, but making decisions about their corporate structure, making decisions about their. It's really an interesting evolution. And when we look at our data, I'm not here to suggest in every category this is lighting the category on fire or changing the trajectory. But, what we've seen over the last few years is many of these these sort of trends have been building momentum, and so there has been a lot of trend chasing, but mostly with really basic, like let's add the keyword to our content if we
Yeah.
think we have any reasonable claim for that trending keyword. I don't know how relevant that's going to be, because you're starting to see companies that are like really walking the walk in a lot of these areas. And I think part of why it's I mean, who really knows where this plays out? Because if you think about if any of these companies became the sort of mainstream prevailing approach, just one that springs to mind is a double-edged safety razor company that I don't know if you've ever shaved with one, but
I've tried. It's
it's
it's not easy.
a little tricky.
Yeah.
The upside to it is the blades are really cheap.
Yeah.
And so I bought like 100 blades 10 years ago, and I still have 30 of them.
Yeah.
But the reason I still have 30 of them is I don't shave with that razor that often, because you nick yourself a lot.
Sure.
Here came a company that said, okay, we can do better than the design that was conceived of 100 years ago. And so we want to preserve the best of the blades ought to be cheap, but we want to replicate the best of the sort of 4 or 5 or 7 blade feel you get in the store.
Sure.
And so the company I'm thinking of is Leaf Shave, but that company, just imagine that everybody ends up buying those razors. You're not going to be replenishing cartridges at anywhere near the same pace. And so, when you start to look at all these different traditional categories, what we're thinking a lot about at the moment is like, which of those categories are trip triggers in brick and mortar? Because if you stop participating in a category, or stop participating in the way that used to drive a certain channel or outlet trip, that's going to have cascading effects on other categories. I mean, the funniest example that popped up in our data and elsewhere during the pandemic was the explosive growth in bidet sales.
Yeah.
And bidets are this thing that I sort of thought of as like, I know they're in some European countries, I think common in Japan.
Yeah.
But as soon as you couldn't buy toilet paper for a couple weeks, the typical problem-solving ingenuity of American consumers said, "Hey, there's another option." So now the question is, what happens in those households?
Yeah.
I mean, I used to laugh 10, 15 years ago. There was a speaker who would go around the industry and talk about household penetration in different categories, and would say, the highest household penetration category is toilet paper at 98%. And you would always laugh.
Who's the
2%? Now I'm like, you may know, it may be the people that, there was a behavioral trigger that got them to make just one switch, and they may not go back. They probably will. I haven't studied it, but if they don't, then you wonder, are they going to shop the same outlets? Are they going to shop at the same frequency? Will the basket change?
Yeah.
All those kinds of questions. So it becomes interesting, because I think what I'm observing is these companies that are really hitting the reset button because they're starting from scratch. One, they serve as inspiration to sort of see, not on a PowerPoint slide, but like a physical product that is actually arriving to consumers, that looks different than what we're used to, is branded differently, is packaged differently. So if nothing else, I would encourage you to like seek out some of these examples, and we'll be publishing more on them, just because it's a great way to imagine where we may be headed in some areas. But if you're in a category where they are already becoming disruptive, I think it's going to be a big call to action to get your whole team together and say, we need to we need to coordinate between the demand chain and supply chain teams, because now we're facing competitors that have thoughtfully made decisions about what they're going to make, how they're going to make it, what they're going to call it, how they're going to describe it, all those things, and how they're going to get it to you. And so, yeah, it's, I think it's early in some ways, but it's an interesting shift.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, it sparks so many ideas, and it's interesting too, because it's not just driven from a consumer desire to have, maybe a greener story, which I think has been looked at from the industry now for a while as pretty cynical. Sure, they want something green, but they're not really willing to pay more for it, or have less convenience, or so maybe it does, maybe it doesn't matter. But when you actually then combine things like shipping costs and other sort of supply chain issues, and you really can kind of make a better mousetrap, I think that is where it gets really, really interesting. So
Yeah.
Keith, this has been great. How do people find out more about you? How do they find out more about Profitero? How do they connect?
I mean, I'm happy for people to email me, keith@profitero.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter @KeithAnderson. There's a country store that shares the same name, so be sure you got the right Keith Anderson.
Okay.
Yeah, and our website, profitero.com. We've been doing a virtual conference series called Commerce Live that brings together a lot of practitioners and experts around the industry. I don't think we've settled on the next session's date, but subscribe to our email newsletter and you'll find out as soon as I do.
Okay, sounds good. Hey, thanks so much for being on.
Yeah, good to speak with you, John. Thanks for having me.
Thanks again for listening to another episode of eCommerce Deep Dive. Be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast platform or on YouTube. And if you get a chance, go in and leave us a rating. It would help a lot. Thanks again, and talk to you soon.